In the summer of 1991, 7-year-old Hannah Briggs vanished without a trace from a church picnic in rural Missouri, leaving behind nothing but her pink ribbon and a community shattered by grief. For 33 years, her parents held on to hope while investigators pursued dead ends and false leads. Then, in October 2024, 2 deer hunters stumbled upon something buried deep in the woods, a rusted metal trunk that would finally reveal the horrifying truth about what happened that sunny afternoon. The discovery would expose a predator who had hidden in plain sight, someone the community had trusted completely, someone who had attended Hannah's memorial service with tears in his eyes. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning of June 15, 1991, started like any other Saturday in the small town of Millbrook, Missouri. Population 3,200, where everyone knew everyone and children still played outside until the streetlights came on. The First Presbyterian Church had organized their annual summer picnic at Meadowbrook Park, a sprawling 50-acre recreational area on the eastern edge of town that featured playground equipment, baseball diamonds, and dense woodland trails that wound through oak and hickory trees. Families had been gathering since 9 in the morning, setting up folding tables laden with potato salad, fried chicken, homemade pies, and gallons of sweet tea that sweated in the June heat. Hannah Briggs arrived with her parents, David and Margaret Briggs, just after 10 o'clock. She wore denim shorts, a yellow t-shirt with a sunflower on the front, white sneakers with pink laces, and her favorite pink ribbon tied in her blonde hair. Margaret would later tell investigators that Hannah had been excited about the picnic for weeks, talking endlessly about the 3-legged race and the watermelon eating contest. David had packed Hannah's bicycle in the truck bed so she could ride on the paved paths with the other children, something she loved doing whenever they visited the park. The Briggs family had lived in Millbrook for 6 years, having moved from Kansas City when David accepted a job as a high school science teacher at Millbrook Regional High School. Margaret worked part-time at the local library, a job that allowed her to be home when Hannah got off the school bus each afternoon. They lived in a modest 2-story house on Elm Street, 3 blocks from the town square, with a garden where Margaret grew tomatoes and Hannah helped plant marigolds each spring. By all accounts, they were a typical American family, active in their church, known for their kindness, and devoted to their only child. Hannah was a bright, curious second grader at Millbrook Elementary School. Her teacher, Mrs. Patricia Caldwell, described her as an enthusiastic student who loved reading books about animals and always volunteered to help clean the classroom after school. She had a gap-toothed smile, freckles across her nose, and an infectious laugh that her mother said could light up a room. She collected stickers, played with dolls, and dreamed of becoming a veterinarian when she grew up. She was afraid of thunderstorms, but loved catching fireflies on summer evenings. She was, in every way, an ordinary little girl living an ordinary life in an ordinary town. The picnic proceeded without incident through the morning hours. Children played tag and kickball while adults chatted in clusters beneath the shade of pavilion roofs. Reverend Peter Jacobson gave a brief blessing before lunch was served at noon, thanking God for the beautiful weather and the fellowship of the community. Hannah ate 2 pieces of fried chicken, corn on the cob, and a slice of chocolate cake before running off to play with a group of children near the swings. Margaret watched her daughter push off on a swing, pumping her legs to go higher, her pink ribbon streaming behind her like a pennant. At approximately 1:45 in the afternoon, Hannah approached her mother and asked if she could ride her bicycle on the trails. Several other children, including 9-year-old Jennifer Walsh and 8-year-old Christopher Dalton, were planning to explore the wooded paths that connected different areas of the park. Margaret hesitated, as she always did when Hannah wanted to venture beyond immediate sight. The trails were safe, well maintained by the county parks department, and regularly used by families. David, who had been talking with other fathers near the grills, walked over and assured Margaret it would be fine. The children would stay together, and besides, the trails looped back to the main picnic area within 20 minutes. Margaret made Hannah promise to stay with the group and be back before 3 o'clock. Hannah nodded eagerly, gave her mother a quick hug, and ran toward the bike rack where her purple bicycle waited. Jennifer Walsh later told investigators that Hannah had been excited, talking about racing to see who could reach the creek bridge first. The group of 5 children, including Hannah, Jennifer, Christopher, and 2 other boys named Marcus Peterson and Billy Garrett, set off down Trail 3, a packed dirt path that wound through the eastern section of woods. What happened next would be reconstructed from witness statements, but gaps remained that would haunt investigators for decades. According to Jennifer Walsh, the children rode single file along the trail, laughing and calling out to each other. About 10 minutes into their ride, Hannah's bicycle chain came loose. The other children stopped, and Marcus Peterson, who was good with mechanical things despite being only 10 years old, tried to fix it. After several minutes of unsuccessful attempts, Hannah told the others to go ahead. She said she would walk her bike back to the picnic area where her father could fix the chain properly. Jennifer asked if Hannah wanted someone to stay with her, but Hannah insisted she would be fine. It was a straight path back after all, and she could see the clearing through the trees. The 4 remaining children continued their ride, reaching the creek bridge and eventually looping back to the main picnic area at approximately 2:30. When adults asked where Hannah was, they explained about the broken bicycle chain. David Briggs immediately felt a spike of concern. He grabbed his truck keys and drove the service road that paralleled Trail 3, expecting to find his daughter walking her bike along the path. He drove slowly, windows down, calling her name. When he reached the spot where the trail began, nearly a mile from where the children said they had left Hannah and found no sign of her, the concern transformed into fear. By 3:15, when Hannah had not appeared, Margaret Briggs was frantic. David organized a group of men from the picnic to search the trails on foot. They spread out, calling Hannah's name, checking every branch of every path. At 3:45, someone found Hannah's bicycle leaning against a tree approximately 200 yards from where the other children had left her. The chain was indeed loose, just as the children had described, but there was no sign of Hannah. Her pink ribbon was found 15 feet away, caught on a low bramble branch, as if it had been torn from her hair. At 4 o'clock, someone called the Millbrook Police Department. Chief Raymond Fuller arrived within 10 minutes with his 2 deputies. By 4:30, the park was swarming with volunteers, police officers, and concerned parents. The picnic had transformed from a celebration into a nightmare. Children were crying, mothers were clutching their own sons and daughters close, and fathers were organizing into search parties with flashlights as the afternoon wore on. Chief Fuller contacted the Missouri State Highway Patrol, requesting additional resources and a search and rescue team with tracking dogs. As darkness fell, portable floodlights were brought in to illuminate the search area. Volunteers combed through the woods, calling Hannah's name until their voices grew hoarse. The tracking dogs arrived just before 8 o'clock, and handlers gave them Hannah's scent from a sweater Margaret had brought from home. The dogs tracked from the bicycle to the spot where the ribbon was found, then circled an area of disturbed earth and leaves before losing the scent entirely near a service road that maintenance vehicles used to access different parts of the park. It was as if Hannah had simply vanished into thin air. The Missouri State Highway Patrol set up a command post in the park parking lot. FBI agents from the Kansas City field office arrived the following morning, bringing expertise in child abduction cases. The first 48 hours were critical, everyone knew that. Statistics showed that if a child was not found within that window, the chances of a positive outcome dropped dramatically. The entire town of Millbrook mobilized. Businesses closed so owners could join search parties. The local radio station broadcast updates every 15 minutes. Flyers with Hannah's photograph were printed by the thousands and distributed throughout Missouri and neighboring states. Investigators interviewed everyone who had been at the picnic. They compiled a list of over 200 attendees, including church members, their families, and guests. Every adult was questioned about their whereabouts between 1:45 and 3:15. Polygraph tests were administered to dozens of individuals, including, painfully, David and Margaret Briggs, a standard procedure that devastated the grieving parents. Everyone passed. Investigators examined the backgrounds of every man at the picnic, looking for criminal records, prior complaints, anything that might suggest a predator in their midst. They found nothing alarming. The park itself became a crime scene. Forensic teams examined every inch of the area where Hannah had last been seen. They found tire tracks on the service road, but the tracks were generic, consistent with dozens of vehicle types, and could have been made any time in the previous week. They found footprints, but in a public park with hundreds of visitors, this evidence proved meaningless. They found no signs of struggle beyond the ribbon caught on the bramble, no blood, no torn clothing, no indication of what had happened to Hannah Briggs. As days turned to weeks, the investigation expanded. Detectives looked into registered sex offenders within a 100-mile radius. They cross-referenced known pedophiles with any possible connection to Millbrook. They examined reports of suspicious vehicles or individuals in the area around the time of Hannah's disappearance. They followed up on hundreds of tips called into the hotline, most of which led nowhere. Someone reported seeing a blue van near the park that afternoon. Investigators tracked down every blue van registered in 3 counties, interviewing owners, examining vehicles. Nothing. The media descended on Millbrook. National news programs featured Hannah's case. Her gap-toothed smile appeared on television screens across America. David and Margaret made tearful appeals for information, begging whoever had taken their daughter to please bring her home. The reward fund grew to $50,000, then $75,000, contributions pouring in from strangers touched by the family's anguish. Psychics called offering visions. Conspiracy theorists proposed elaborate scenarios. None of it helped. One person who was interviewed but quickly dismissed as a suspect was Robert McHale, the head groundskeeper for Millbrook County Parks Department. McHale was 42 years old in 1991, a quiet man who had worked for the county for 8 years. He had been on duty the day of the picnic, driving around the park in his maintenance truck, emptying trash cans, checking facilities. Multiple witnesses remembered seeing him throughout the afternoon. He had even helped set up some of the picnic tables for the church group that morning. When questioned, he expressed shock and sadness about Hannah's disappearance. He had participated in the search efforts, working alongside volunteers through the night. Investigators noted that he seemed genuinely distraught. McHale had no criminal record. He had grown up in a small town in southern Missouri, dropped out of high school in 10th grade, worked various manual labor jobs before landing the position with the Parks Department. He lived alone in a rented house on the outskirts of Millbrook. Neighbors described him as polite but reserved, someone who kept to himself. He attended the Methodist church occasionally but was not particularly active in the community. His background check revealed nothing concerning. He was single, never married, no children. His supervisor at the Parks Department gave him positive evaluations, noting that he was reliable and hardworking. Investigators interviewed him twice, briefly, and moved on to other leads that seemed more promising. As summer faded to fall and fall to winter, the intensive search efforts gradually diminished. Volunteers returned to their normal lives. Media attention shifted to other stories. The FBI agents went back to Kansas City, leaving the case in the hands of local investigators who continued working leads but found themselves running into dead ends at every turn. David Briggs returned to teaching, though colleagues said he was a shell of his former self. Margaret took a leave of absence from the library. The house on Elm Street became a shrine of grief. Hannah's room preserved exactly as she had left it, waiting for a return that never came. The First Presbyterian Church held a memorial service in December 1991, though it was not a funeral. Margaret refused to have a funeral, refused to accept that her daughter was dead. Hope, however irrational, was all she had left. Reverend Jacobson spoke about faith in dark times, about trusting in God's plan even when that plan made no sense. The sanctuary was packed with townspeople who wept openly, mourning not just for Hannah but for the loss of innocence that her disappearance represented. Millbrook would never be the same. Parents no longer let their children play outside unsupervised. The trails at Meadowbrook Park fell into disuse, becoming overgrown and forgotten. Years passed. The case remained open but cold. Periodically, new investigators would review the file, hoping fresh eyes might spot something previous detectives had missed. Nothing materialized. Hannah's case was featured on unsolved mystery television programs in 1994 and again in 2003. Each broadcast generated a flurry of tips, but none led to any breakthroughs. The Briggs family endured anniversaries and birthdays marked by absence. Margaret aged rapidly, her hair turning gray, her face etched with permanent sorrow. David developed heart problems that his doctors attributed to chronic stress. They stayed in Millbrook, unable to leave the place where they had last seen their daughter, as if leaving would mean abandoning Hannah completely. In 1993, 2 years after Hannah's disappearance, Robert McHale quietly left Millbrook. He gave notice to the Parks Department, citing family obligations in another state. His supervisor was sorry to see him go. He had been a dependable employee. No one thought much of his departure. People moved away from small towns all the time, seeking opportunities elsewhere. Investigators, overwhelmed with other cases and no new leads in the Briggs case, did not track his whereabouts. He had never been considered a serious suspect, just another person who happened to be present the day Hannah vanished. The investigation continued in sporadic bursts over the decades. In 2008, cold case detectives used new DNA technology to re-examine evidence from the scene, hoping to find genetic material that earlier methods might have missed. They found nothing usable. In 2015, age progression photographs of Hannah were released, showing what she might look like at 31 years old. The images were distributed widely on social media. Thousands of people shared the posts. Tips came in from across the country, people claiming they knew a woman who looked like the progression photos. Each lead was investigated and ruled out. The woman who might have been Hannah Briggs remained a ghost. David Briggs passed away in March 2020 from complications related to his heart condition. He was 69 years old. At his funeral, friends said quietly that he had died of a broken heart, that losing Hannah had killed him slowly over 3 decades. Margaret, now 71 and in declining health, continued to live in the house on Elm Street alone. Surrounded by photographs of the daughter she had lost and the husband she had buried, she kept Hannah's room exactly as it had been in 1991, a time capsule of childhood frozen in June of that year. Pink curtains, stuffed animals on the bed, drawings taped to the walls. On October 19, 2024, 2 deer hunters named Frank Hutchinson and Dale Rivera were tracking a wounded buck through private property adjacent to what had once been Meadowbrook Park. The park itself had been sold to a developer in 2018, and portions of it subdivided for housing construction. The wooded areas remained mostly intact, too hilly and dense for profitable development. Hutchinson and Rivera had permission from the landowner to hunt the property, something they did every fall. They were approximately 3/4 of a mile from where the old trail system had been, in a section of woods that was not part of the original park but bordered it, when Rivera noticed something unusual. The buck they were tracking had disturbed a pile of rotted logs and debris, revealing a corner of rusted metal beneath. At first, Rivera thought it might be an old moonshine still or discarded farm equipment. Rural areas were full of such relics, remnants of earlier times left to decay in the forest. But something about the way it was positioned, deliberately covered, made him curious. The 2 men cleared away the logs, leaves, and 33 years of accumulated forest debris. What they uncovered was a metal footlocker, the kind military personnel once used, approximately 3 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 2 feet deep. It was badly rusted, covered in dents, and secured with a padlock that had corroded almost entirely away. Hutchinson looked at Rivera. They both felt a sudden chill despite the warm October afternoon. This was not casual dumping. Someone had buried this container deliberately, had covered it carefully, had intended for it to stay hidden. Rivera pulled out his cell phone and called the county sheriff's department. He explained what they had found and their location. The dispatcher told them not to touch anything else and that deputies were on their way. Hutchinson and Rivera stood guard over their discovery, neither man speaking much, both understanding that they had stumbled onto something significant, something dark. When sheriff's deputies arrived 40 minutes later, followed shortly by investigators from the Missouri State Highway Patrol, the area was cordoned off with crime scene tape. Detective Maria Gonzalez, a 20-year veteran of the Highway Patrol and head of the cold case unit, supervised the excavation. The footlocker was carefully photographed in situ before being extracted from its burial site. The soil beneath and around it was collected for analysis. When the locker was opened in a controlled environment at the State Crime Lab 3 days later, its contents told a story that investigators had feared for 33 years. Inside the footlocker were children's items: a pair of small white sneakers with pink laces, size 13, a yellow t-shirt with a sunflower on the front, child size small, denim shorts, size 7, underwear with cartoon characters, a pink hair ribbon. These items matched exactly the clothing Hannah Briggs had been wearing the day she disappeared. But there was more. A child's wristwatch, stopped at 217, a library card in Hannah's name, and most chillingly, a Polaroid photograph of a terrified little girl with blonde hair and a gap-toothed smile, bound and gagged, tears streaming down her face. The forensic examination revealed more. Beneath the clothing were documents, papers that had partially survived the decades in the sealed container. There were handwritten notes, disturbing in their content, detailing obsessive thoughts about children. There were newspaper clippings about Hannah's disappearance. And there was a partial name visible on a water-damaged envelope, McHale, followed by illegible letters, and a street address in Millbrook that researchers quickly identified as the house Robert McHale had rented in the early 90s. Detective Gonzalez pulled the original case file and began reading. Robert McHale's name appeared in the witness statements, interviewed briefly as the groundskeeper on duty that day. She noted that he had left town in 1993 and apparently had never been tracked afterward. She began the painstaking process of tracing his movements over the past 3 decades: property records, tax filings, employment records, vehicle registrations. It took 2 weeks of intensive investigation, but they finally located him. Robert McHale was now 75 years old and living in a small town in Arkansas, about 300 miles from Millbrook. He had worked various maintenance jobs over the years, always staying in rural areas, always keeping a low profile. He had never married, had no known close relationships. He lived in a trailer park on the outskirts of a town called Pineville, population 800. Local authorities were contacted, and on November 5, 2024, Detective Gonzalez and a team of investigators arrived in Pineville with an arrest warrant. When they knocked on the door of McHale's trailer at 6 in the morning, he answered in a bathrobe, looking confused and elderly. But when Detective Gonzalez identified herself and stated the reason for their visit, something shifted in his expression. It was not surprise, Gonzalez would later testify. It was resignation, as if he had been waiting 33 years for this moment to arrive. He did not resist arrest. He did not ask for a lawyer. He simply nodded slowly and said, in a quiet voice that Gonzalez strained to hear, "I knew this day would come eventually." The trailer was searched, pursuant to the warrant. What investigators found confirmed their worst fears and answered questions that had tormented a community for 3 decades. In a locked metal cabinet, they discovered dozens of Polaroid photographs of children, including several of Hannah Briggs. The photos documented what appeared to be hours of captivity, showing a terrified little girl in what looked like a basement or cellar. There were handwritten journals, thousands of pages spanning decades, in which McHale detailed his crimes in meticulous, disturbing prose. According to the journals and subsequent confession, Robert McHale had been watching Hannah for weeks before the picnic. He had noticed her during previous visits to Meadowbrook Park with her family. Something about her, he would later tell investigators in chilling interviews, had become an obsession. When he learned that the church picnic would be held at the park, he saw an opportunity. He had known the trails intimately, had known about the old service roads and hidden paths. He had prepared a place, a root cellar on an abandoned property he had access to through his work with the Parks Department. On June 15, 1991, McHale had been driving his maintenance truck along the service road when he spotted Hannah walking alone with her broken bicycle. The other children had gone ahead, just as he had hoped when he had loosened the chain earlier that morning while pretending to help set up picnic tables. He had approached Hannah, identified himself as the park groundskeeper, someone she had probably seen before, someone who wore an official uniform and represented authority. He told her he would fix her bicycle, that his tools were just a short distance away in his truck. Trusting, as children in small towns in 1991 still were, Hannah had gone with him. The journals did not spare details, but out of respect for Hannah's memory and her surviving family, investigators did not release the specifics of what Hannah endured in the hours before her death. The forensic evidence and McHale's confession confirmed that Hannah had died that same evening, approximately 6 hours after her abduction. McHale buried her body in a remote location that he refused to divulge despite intensive questioning. The footlocker with her belongings and the photographs he buried separately in the wooded area where it was eventually discovered, perhaps as some kind of trophy or perverted memorial. After disposing of Hannah's body, McHale had returned to Millbrook, had joined the search parties, had stood shoulder to shoulder with David Briggs, looking for a child he knew was dead. He had attended the memorial service, had accepted condolences from neighbors who praised his dedication to the search effort. For 2 years he had continued living in Millbrook, working at the park, maintaining the very trails where he had abducted Hannah. Then, as investigators began occasionally revisiting the case and rumors circulated about new forensic techniques, he had decided to leave, to disappear into the anonymity of rural America. The arrest made national headlines. The story of Hannah Briggs, cold case closed after 33 years, spread across news programs and social media. In Millbrook, the reaction was a complicated mixture of relief, grief, and rage. Margaret Briggs, now 72 years old and confined to a wheelchair due to declining health, finally had answers. She wept when Detective Gonzalez visited her personally to explain what had been discovered. The tears were not entirely of sorrow. There was closure in knowing, terrible as the truth was, an end to 3 decades of not knowing, of imagining scenarios that were sometimes worse than reality, of hoping against hope that somehow, somewhere, Hannah might still be alive. Robert McHale was charged with kidnapping, sexual assault, and first-degree murder. He pleaded guilty to all charges in February 2025, sparing the court and Hannah's family the ordeal of a trial. At his sentencing hearing in April 2025, Margaret Briggs attended in her wheelchair, pushed by her sister who had moved to Millbrook to care for her. When given the opportunity to address McHale directly, Margaret spoke in a voice that shook but did not break. She told McHale that he had not only taken Hannah's life, but had stolen 33 years from her family. David had died without knowing what happened to their daughter. She herself had spent 3 decades in a fog of grief and uncertainty. McHale had stolen countless ordinary moments: Hannah's first day of high school, her prom, her graduation, her wedding day, grandchildren that would never exist. He had stolen Hannah's chance to grow up, to become whoever she might have been. And for what? To satisfy his own sick desires? Margaret said she hoped he would spend whatever time he had left on Earth thinking about the destruction he had caused, the lives he had ruined, not just Hannah's but everyone who loved her. The judge sentenced Robert McHale to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Given his age and health problems, it was understood that this was effectively a death sentence. McHale was transferred to a maximum security facility where he would spend his remaining days. Even in his confession, he refused to reveal the location of Hannah's remains, his final act of cruelty. Search teams attempted to locate her body based on geographical analysis and patterns suggested by forensic psychologists. But the areas McHale had access to during his time in Missouri were vast and had changed significantly over 3 decades. In June 2025, 34 years to the day after Hannah's disappearance, the town of Millbrook held a memorial service at the First Presbyterian Church. Margaret Briggs attended, frail but determined. The sanctuary was filled with people who remembered the bright 7-year-old girl in the yellow sunflower t-shirt. Reverend Jacobson, now retired, came out of retirement to officiate. He spoke about how evil can hide in plain sight, how predators exploit trust and innocence, but also about how truth eventually emerges, how justice, even delayed, is still justice. He spoke about Hannah not as a victim but as the vibrant child she had been, someone whose brief life had touched the community and whose loss had changed it forever. The case sparked renewed discussions about child safety, about the importance of vigilance, about how predators often operate from positions of trust and authority. The Millbrook County Parks Department implemented new policies regarding background checks and supervision. School districts throughout Missouri revised their safety protocols. Hannah's case became a teaching moment, as tragic as that was, a reminder that danger does not always look like a stranger in a dark van, but sometimes appears in familiar forms, in uniforms and trusted roles. Margaret Briggs lived for 1 more year after McHale's conviction. She died peacefully in her sleep in May 2026, at the age of 73. Her obituary noted that she was preceded in death by her beloved husband David and her cherished daughter Hannah. The funeral was well attended, the community coming together once more to support a family that had endured unimaginable loss with grace and dignity. Margaret was buried beside David in Millbrook Cemetery. At the family's request, a marker was placed between their graves, inscribed with Hannah's name and dates: July 3, 1983 to June 15, 1991, though no body lay beneath it. In memory of our precious daughter, the inscription read, "Forever 7, forever loved, forever missed." The footlocker and its contents remained in evidence, stored in a secure facility, potential evidence should any additional charges ever be filed or any new information emerge. The Polaroid photographs, those horrible documents of a child's terror, were sealed by court order, never to be released to the public. Hannah's clothing was eventually released to what remained of her family, a cousin who preserved the items in a private memorial. The sneakers with their pink laces, the yellow t-shirt, the pink ribbon, objects that had once adorned a happy little girl on a summer day, now relics of a crime that had haunted a community for over 3 decades. Detective Maria Gonzalez, who had led the investigation that finally brought resolution to the case, spoke at law enforcement conferences about the importance of preserving cold case evidence and the value of never giving up on victims. She emphasized that advances in forensic technology meant that cases which seemed unsolvable in the past might yield answers in the future. She also spoke about the human element, the families who live with absence, who deserve answers, who need closure even when that closure brings pain. Hannah's case, she said, reminded her why she had become a detective in the first place: to speak for those who could no longer speak for themselves, to bring monsters into the light, to provide families with truth even when truth was terrible. The hunters who discovered the footlocker, Frank Hutchinson and Dale Rivera, never hunted in those woods again. The discovery had changed something for them, turned a recreational activity into a reminder of human evil. They attended Margaret Briggs's funeral, sitting in the back of the church, strangers who had nonetheless played a crucial role in the final chapter of Hannah's story. Afterward, they set up a small scholarship fund in Hannah's name at Millbrook Elementary School, awarded annually to a second-grade student who demonstrated kindness and curiosity, the qualities Hannah's teacher had remembered about her. Robert McHale, isolated in prison and shunned even by other inmates who reserve particular hatred for those who harm children, died of a heart attack in August 2027 at the age of 78. His death was noted in a brief news article, a footnote to the larger story. There was no funeral, no mourners. His body was cremated and the ashes disposed of without ceremony. In his final years, he had given several interviews to forensic psychologists studying criminal behavior, but he never revealed the location of Hannah's body. Some speculated this final secret was his way of maintaining power, of ensuring he would be remembered, of guaranteeing that even in death he could cause pain. Others thought perhaps he genuinely could not remember after so many years, that the specific location had faded from his memory while the crimes remained vivid. The woods where Hannah was last seen alive have been largely developed now, the trails paved over, houses built on land that was once dense forest. Meadowbrook Park itself exists only in memory and in the historical records of Millbrook. A small section of the original park was preserved as green space, and in 2028 the town erected a memorial there. It is a simple stone bench with a bronze plaque that reads, "In memory of Hannah Marie Briggs, July 3, 1983 to June 15, 1991, taken too soon but never forgotten." The bench faces east, toward the rising sun, and fresh flowers appear there regularly, left by people who never knew Hannah but who were touched by her story. The case file for Hannah Briggs, once active and urgent, then cold and gathering dust, then active again with renewed urgency, was finally closed in November 2027 following McHale's death. The thousands of pages of reports, witness statements, evidence logs, and investigative notes were archived, preserved for history and for future law enforcement training. Hannah's story became part of the curriculum at the Missouri State Highway Patrol Academy, a case study in the importance of thorough documentation, the value of preserving evidence, and the reality that justice sometimes takes decades but can still be achieved. In the years following the resolution of the case, several long-form articles and a documentary film examined Hannah's story and the investigation. The documentary titled Taken: The Hannah Briggs Story featured interviews with Detective Gonzalez, with Frank Hutchinson and Dale Rivera, with residents of Millbrook who had known the family, and with forensic psychologists who analyzed McHale's behavior. It was nominated for several awards and helped raise awareness about child safety and the lasting impact of violent crime on communities. A portion of the proceeds was donated to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in Hannah's name. The house on Elm Street where Hannah had grown up, where Margaret and David had lived with their grief, was eventually sold by the estate. The new owners, a young couple with no connection to the tragedy, were aware of the history but chose to make the house their home anyway. They painted the walls, updated the kitchen, and turned Hannah's room, preserved for so long as a shrine, into a nursery for their own daughter. Life, as it always does, moved forward. In Millbrook today, there are people who remember June 15, 1991 vividly, who recall the panic and the search parties and the floodlights in the darkness. There are others, younger residents, who know the story only as history, something that happened before they were born. The First Presbyterian Church still holds its annual summer picnic, though it is now hosted at a different location, a park on the opposite side of town. Children still play and laugh and eat watermelon. Parents still watch their kids with perhaps a bit more vigilance than they might have before Hannah's case, an invisible legacy of her loss. Hannah Briggs would have been 41 years old in 2024, the year her case was finally solved. She might have had a career, a family, children of her own. She might have fulfilled her childhood dream of becoming a veterinarian, or she might have discovered other passions, other paths. The world will never know who Hannah might have become, what contributions she might have made, what joys she might have experienced. Her life was reduced to 7 years, 3 months, and 12 days, ended by a predator who saw her not as a human being with infinite potential, but as an object for his own gratification. Yet Hannah's story, tragic as it is, also demonstrates the persistence of love and the determination of those who seek justice. Her parents never stopped hoping for answers. Investigators never stopped working the case, even when leads dried up and years passed without progress. A community never forgot her, keeping her memory alive through decades. And in the end, justice came, delayed by 33 years, but no less meaningful for the wait. Robert McHale died in prison, his crimes exposed, his name forever associated with evil, his legacy one of shame and condemnation. The resolution of Hannah's case brought peace to Margaret Briggs in her final year of life. She told Detective Gonzalez during their last meeting that while nothing could bring Hannah back, while nothing could restore the years stolen from their family, at least now she knew. The not knowing, she said, had been its own special torture, worse in some ways than the truth. Now she could lay beside David, and they could be at peace, knowing their daughter's killer had been caught, knowing Hannah's story had been told, knowing their little girl would not be forgotten. In the broader context of missing children cases, Hannah's story represents both the horror of predatory violence and the importance of never giving up. Cold cases can be solved, sometimes decades later. Evidence preserved from earlier investigations can become valuable when examined with new technology or fresh perspective. The hunters who stumbled upon the buried footlocker had no idea they were about to solve a case that had baffled investigators for over 3 decades. Their decision to call authorities rather than simply ignore the unusual find made all the difference. The case also highlighted the reality that predators often hide in plain sight, that they can be someone familiar, someone in a position of trust, someone who appears normal and unremarkable. Robert McHale attended the church picnic as part of his job. He helped set up tables. He joined the search for Hannah. He attended her memorial service. He lived in the community for 2 more years, walking past the Briggs house, shopping at the same grocery store, attending the same church on occasion. The monster did not look like a monster. He looked like a quiet man who kept to himself. Someone easy to overlook, someone forgettable. That ordinariness was part of what made him dangerous and part of what allowed him to escape detection for so long. Today, improvements in technology, better communication between law enforcement agencies, expanded databases of criminal offenders, and increased public awareness have made it somewhat more difficult for predators to operate undetected. But the fundamental truth remains that evil exists, that children are vulnerable, and that vigilance is necessary. Hannah's case serves as a reminder of these uncomfortable realities and as a call to action to protect the innocent. The small Missouri town of Millbrook carries Hannah's memory in its collective consciousness, a scar that has healed but never completely faded. The older generation, those who knew Hannah or who participated in the search, carry her story as a personal loss. The younger generation, learning about Hannah in school or from parents, understand her as a symbol of innocence lost, a reminder of why parents set rules and why safety matters. Her story has become part of the town's identity, something that shaped its character and its values. As the years continue to pass, as the people who knew Hannah personally grow older and eventually pass away themselves, her story will transition from living memory to history. Future generations will know her only through photographs and news articles and the memorial bench in the park. But as long as her story is told, as long as her name is remembered, Hannah Briggs remains more than a victim. She remains a person, a little girl who loved animals and collected stickers and dreamed of growing up to help creatures who could not help themselves. She remains a daughter who was cherished by parents who never stopped loving her. She remains a reminder of the preciousness of childhood and the importance of protecting it. The pink ribbon found on the bramble branch in June 1991, the one that had been tied in Hannah's blonde hair that morning when she left for the picnic, was eventually returned to the family estate after serving as evidence. That ribbon, faded now, stained by time and forest debris, represents the fragility of innocence, how easily it can be torn away, how something so simple can become a symbol of loss. It is preserved now in a small archive of Hannah's belongings, a tangible connection to a little girl who loved the color pink, who tied ribbons in her hair, who was excited about a church picnic on a summer day. The resolution of Hannah Briggs's case after 33 years stands as testament to the dedication of law enforcement officers who refuse to let cold cases remain forgotten. Detective Maria Gonzalez and her team spent countless hours reviewing old evidence, tracing leads, and ultimately building a case that brought a killer to justice 3 decades after his crime. Their work honored Hannah's memory and provided her family with the answers they deserved. It demonstrated that no case is truly closed until it is solved, that victims deserve justice no matter how much time has passed, that the search for truth is worthwhile, even when the truth is painful. For the town of Millbrook, the solving of Hannah's case brought a sense of closure that had been missing for 33 years. The community had lived with the unresolved mystery, with the fear and uncertainty that accompanied not knowing what had happened or whether the perpetrator might strike again. The arrest of Robert McHale and the revelation that he had left town decades earlier relieved some of that anxiety, though it could not erase the tragedy itself. The town continues to honor Hannah's memory, ensuring that her story serves as both a memorial and a lesson. In the end, Hannah Briggs was 7 years old, a second grader with a gap-toothed smile and dreams of caring for animals. She went to a church picnic on a beautiful June day, rode her bicycle on a wooded trail, and encountered evil in human form. She did not come home. For 33 years, her fate remained unknown, a mystery that tortured her family and haunted her community. Then, on a fall day in 2024, 2 hunters stumbled upon a buried footlocker and the truth finally emerged. Justice came late, but it came. Hannah's killer was caught, tried, and imprisoned. Her parents, though both gone now, died knowing the truth. And Hannah herself, forever 7 years old, is remembered not as a nameless victim but as a beloved daughter, a bright student, a little girl who deserved to grow up, and whose loss diminished everyone who knew her story. The yellow t-shirt with the sunflower, the white sneakers with pink laces, the pink ribbon, These ordinary items became extraordinary through the tragedy they represented. They are preserved now, evidence of a crime, but also evidence of a life, however brief. They remind us that behind every cold case is a person, someone who was loved, someone who mattered, someone whose absence leaves a hole that can never be filled. Hannah Briggs mattered. Her life mattered. Her story matters. And in telling it, in remembering her, we honor not just her memory but all those who have been taken too soon, all those whose cases remain unsolved, all those who wait for justice. The investigation that finally cracked the case in 2024 involved more than just the physical discovery of the footlocker. Detective Maria Gonzalez had assembled a team of specialists who brought fresh perspectives to evidence that had been examined countless times before. Among them was Dr. Patricia Chen, a forensic anthropologist from the University of Missouri who had developed new techniques for analyzing soil composition and determining burial timelines. When the footlocker was brought to the lab, Dr. Chen examined the soil layers that had accumulated on and around the metal container, creating a geological timeline that helped investigators understand not just when it had been buried but how the burial site had been chosen and prepared. Dr. Chen determined that the location where the footlocker was found had been deliberately selected because of its position on a slight elevation that would prevent water accumulation during heavy rains, which explained why the contents, while damaged, had not been completely destroyed by moisture over 33 years. The person who buried it had known the land intimately, had understood drainage patterns and soil composition. This detail became another piece of evidence pointing to Robert McHale, whose job as a groundskeeper would have given him exactly that kind of knowledge about the terrain in and around Meadowbrook Park. Another member of Gonzalez's team was forensic psychologist Dr. Raymond Fletcher, who specialized in creating behavioral profiles of offenders in cold cases. When McHale's journals were recovered from his trailer in Arkansas, Dr. Fletcher spent weeks analyzing the handwriting, the language patterns, the progression of thoughts documented across decades. What he discovered was chilling in its implications. McHale's journals revealed that Hannah had not been his first victim, though she appeared to be the only one he had killed. References in the journals, coded and oblique, suggested other incidents, other children who had been watched, followed, perhaps even approached but not abducted. Dr. Fletcher worked with law enforcement agencies across Missouri and neighboring states to cross-reference McHale's employment history and known locations with unsolved cases involving children. In 3 instances, reports of suspicious behavior toward children in parks or public spaces aligned with times and places where McHale had been living or working. In one case, from 1987 in a town called Clearwater, a 9-year-old girl had reported that a maintenance worker at the city pool had made her uncomfortable, following her into areas where other people were not present, asking her personal questions. The girl's mother had complained to the pool management, and the worker, whose name the records showed was Robert McHale, had been quietly let go. No criminal charges were filed because no crime had technically been committed, just behavior that crossed boundaries and raised concerns. These discoveries led to a broader investigation into McHale's entire life history. Investigators traced his movements back to his childhood in a small town called Fordsville in southern Missouri. County records showed that McHale had been born in April 1949 to Martha and Leonard McHale. His father worked at a grain elevator. His mother was a homemaker. By all accounts, the family was poor but not destitute, working-class people who attended the Baptist church and kept to themselves. Robert was the middle child of 3 boys, with an older brother named Kenneth and a younger brother named James. Investigators interviewed both brothers, now elderly men themselves, to understand what kind of childhood their brother had experienced. Kenneth McHale, 78 years old and living in a nursing home in Springfield, Missouri, had not spoken to Robert in over 40 years. When investigators told him about the charges against his brother, Kenneth broke down crying, saying he had always known something was wrong with Robert but had never imagined the extent of it. Kenneth described their childhood as difficult, marked by their father's alcoholism and violent temper. Leonard McHale had beaten all 3 boys regularly, but Robert, Kenneth said, seemed to bear the brunt of it, perhaps because he was smaller and more timid than his brothers. Kenneth recalled an incident when Robert was about 12 years old. Their father had caught Robert looking at a catalog advertisement featuring children's clothing, specifically focusing on the images of young girls modeling dresses. Leonard had beaten Robert severely, accusing him of perverse thoughts, and had forced him to burn the catalog page while the family watched. Kenneth said that after that incident, Robert became even more withdrawn, spending hours alone in the woods behind their house, rarely speaking at meals, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Their mother, Martha, too intimidated by her husband to intervene in his punishments, had tried to show Robert extra kindness when Leonard was not around, but the damage had been done. James McHale, the youngest brother, now 73 and living in Texas, had a similar story. He told investigators that Robert had always been different, isolated and strange, even before the beatings intensified. James remembered Robert collecting dead insects and small animals he found in the woods, keeping them in jars in a shed until they decomposed. When their mother discovered this, she made Robert dispose of them, but James suspected his brother had simply moved his collection to a more hidden location. James also recalled that Robert seemed fascinated by the children who lived on neighboring farms, watching them play from a distance but never approaching or trying to join them. Both brothers confirmed that Robert had dropped out of high school in 10th grade and left home shortly afterward. They had assumed he had gone to find work in a larger town, which was common for young men from poor rural families in the 1960s. Neither brother had maintained regular contact with Robert after he left. Kenneth said Robert had called once or twice in the early years, awkward conversations where they struggled to find anything to say to each other, but the calls eventually stopped. The last time Kenneth saw Robert was at their mother's funeral in 1982. Their father had died years earlier from cirrhosis of the liver. At the funeral, Robert had stood apart from the family, barely speaking, leaving immediately after the service ended. This background information helped Dr. Fletcher construct a more complete profile. He concluded that McHale fit the pattern of what criminologists call an inadequate offender, someone whose crimes stem partly from social isolation, sexual deviance that develops without appropriate intervention, and a fundamental inability to form normal human relationships. The childhood abuse McHale suffered likely contributed to his psychological development, though Dr. Fletcher was careful to note that many people suffer abuse without becoming predators themselves. The combination of factors in McHale's case, the abuse, the isolation, the early signs of deviant interests, and the lack of any intervention or treatment, had created someone dangerous who learned to hide his proclivities behind a facade of quiet normalcy. The investigation also revealed how McHale had managed to avoid detection for so long. His employment history showed a pattern of short-term jobs in parks, schools, community centers, always positions that gave him access to children but never requiring extensive background checks, which were less rigorous in the 1970s and 80s than they became in later decades. He rarely stayed in one place longer than 5 or 6 years, moving before anyone could notice patterns in his behavior or before any complaints could accumulate into serious concerns. The job in Millbrook had been his longest tenure anywhere, 8 years, which perhaps explained why he had felt secure enough to act on his impulses with Hannah. After leaving Millbrook in 1993, McHale had worked as a school custodian in a town in Oklahoma for 3 years, then as a maintenance worker at a church camp in Kansas for 4 years, then various other positions that kept him moving through rural America. Investigators contacted law enforcement in each location, asking them to review any unsolved cases or reports of suspicious behavior involving children during the years McHale was present. While nothing definitive emerged that could be linked directly to him, there were enough concerning coincidences to suggest that Hannah might not have been his only victim, just the only one whose case was solved. The revelation that a predator had moved through various communities, working in positions of trust, undetected for decades, sent shockwaves through small towns across the Midwest. Parents who had lived in places where McHale had worked began questioning their own memories, wondering if their children had ever been in danger, if any strange incidents from years past might have involved this man. Support groups formed online where people shared information and experiences. Several individuals came forward with stories of uncomfortable encounters with maintenance workers or groundskeepers in the 1980s and 90s, though most could not positively identify McHale from photographs shown to them decades later. In Millbrook specifically, the discovery of McHale's guilt reopened old wounds but also brought a sense of validation to some residents who had always felt the investigation had missed something. Jennifer Walsh, the girl who had been riding bicycles with Hannah that day, now a 42-year-old mother of 3 living in Kansas City, "I've learned about the case resolution from a friend who saw it on the news." Jennifer had carried guilt for 33 years, wondering if she should have insisted that Hannah come with the group or if she should have stayed behind with her friend. When Detective Gonzalez contacted Jennifer to inform her personally about the arrest, Jennifer broke down, saying she had replayed that day thousands of times in her mind, always wondering what she could have done differently. Detective Gonzalez, who had experience dealing with witnesses and survivors who carried undeserved guilt, spent over an hour on the phone with Jennifer, explaining that she had been a child, that she had done nothing wrong, that the only person responsible for what happened to Hannah was Robert McHale. Jennifer struggled to accept this absolution, but Gonzalez's words helped her begin processing the trauma she had carried in silence for decades. Jennifer revealed that she had never felt entirely safe in wooded areas after that day, that she had always been hypervigilant with her own children, perhaps overly protective in ways that her husband sometimes questioned. Learning that the perpetrator had been caught and convicted allowed Jennifer to begin working through these lingering effects with a therapist who specialized in trauma. Christopher Dalton, Marcus Peterson, and Billy Garrett, the other children who had been riding bikes with Hannah that day, also learned about the case resolution. Christopher was now living in Colorado, working as an engineer, married with 2 daughters. Marcus had stayed in Missouri, running a small construction business, divorced with 1 son. Billy had tragically died in a car accident in 2007, never learning what had happened to the friend he had tried to help fix a bicycle chain when they were children. Each of the surviving men had their own complicated relationships with that day, memories they had tried to bury or forget, guilt they carried about leaving Hannah behind even though they had been children following a reasonable plan. In the months following McHale's conviction, several of these individuals connected through social media, forming a support network of people bound by shared trauma. They organized a gathering in Millbrook in August 2025, meeting at the memorial bench that had been erected in Hannah's honor. It was an emotional reunion. Adults who had last seen each other as children now sharing memories and feelings they had suppressed for decades. They talked about Hannah, remembering her as she had been, a giggly 7-year-old who loved riding her bike and playing tag. They shared their own struggles with guilt and trauma. And they found comfort in community, in knowing they were not alone in carrying the weight of that June day in 1991. The case also had a significant impact on law enforcement training and procedures. The Missouri State Highway Patrol used Hannah's case as a centerpiece in their updated cold case investigation protocols. The fact that Robert McHale had been interviewed early in the investigation but not seriously considered as a suspect became a teaching point about the importance of thoroughly investigating everyone present at a crime scene, not just those who immediately seem suspicious. McHale's ability to deflect suspicion by actively participating in the search efforts highlighted how predators often insert themselves into investigations, sometimes even becoming witnesses or helpers to satisfy their need to be close to the crime they committed. Detective Gonzalez gave presentations at law enforcement conferences across the country, using Hannah's case to illustrate several key principles. First, the importance of preserving all evidence, even when its relevance is not immediately apparent. The tire tracks found on the service road in 1991 had been photographed and documented but seemed too generic to be useful at the time. In 2024, when investigators were building a case against McHale, those photographs helped establish that his maintenance truck could have been at that location. Second, the value of maintaining detailed witness lists. The fact that McHale's name appeared in the original case file, even though he had not been seriously investigated, gave modern investigators a starting point when the footlocker evidence pointed to someone with intimate knowledge of the park. Third, Gonzalez emphasized the importance of following up on individuals who leave an area shortly after a crime. McHale's departure from Millbrook in 1993 had not raised red flags at the time because he had given a reasonable explanation and because he had never been a strong suspect. But in retrospect, the timing was significant. Investigators in cold cases now routinely examine who moved away from the area in the months and years following an unsolved crime, recognizing that perpetrators often relocate to escape detection or because proximity to the crime scene becomes psychologically uncomfortable for them. The forensic analysis of the journals McHale had kept provided unprecedented insight into the mind of a predator. With McHale's conviction secured and him no longer able to harm anyone, Dr. Fletcher received permission to publish selected excerpts from the journals in a criminology journal, with all identifying information about Hannah and other potential victims removed or redacted. The publication sparked intense debate in academic circles about the balance between public interest in understanding criminal psychology and respect for victims and their families. Dr. Fletcher argued that studying such documents, disturbing as they were, helped law enforcement better understand how predators think and operate, potentially preventing future crimes. The journals revealed that McHale had been aware his attraction to children was wrong but felt powerless to control it. He wrote about attempts to suppress his urges, to avoid situations where he would be near children, but these efforts always failed. He described his job choices as deliberate, seeking positions that gave him access to children while maintaining a veneer of normalcy. He wrote about the careful planning that went into the abduction of Hannah, how he had observed the church picnic routines for weeks beforehand, how he had identified vulnerabilities in supervision, how he had tampered with Hannah's bicycle chain early that morning, creating the opportunity he needed. Most disturbingly, the journals contained reflections written in the days and weeks after Hannah's death, McHale described participating in the search efforts as both thrilling and terrifying. He wrote about standing next to David Briggs, calling out Hannah's name while knowing she would never answer, feeling a mixture of guilt, fear, and a perverse satisfaction at being at the center of the community's attention. He wrote about attending the memorial service, watching Margaret Briggs cry, and feeling nothing beyond concern that investigators might somehow discover his role. The journals portrayed someone fundamentally disconnected from normal human empathy, someone capable of committing an atrocious act and then seamlessly returning to everyday life. Dr. Fletcher's analysis suggested that McHale represented a particularly dangerous type of offender precisely because of his ability to appear unremarkable. Unlike predators who stand out because of obvious social deficits or suspicious behavior, McHale had mastered the art of blending in. He was polite, quiet, and competent at his job. He attended church occasionally, maintaining the appearance of community membership without deep involvement. He was neither overtly friendly, which might draw attention, nor obviously antisocial, which might raise suspicions. This ability to occupy a middle ground of normalcy was what had allowed him to operate undetected for decades. The case also prompted discussions about the limitations of background checks and screening procedures. In the early 1990s, criminal background checks for employment were less comprehensive than they would become in later years. McHale had no criminal record when he was hired by the Millbrook County Parks Department, so there was nothing that would have flagged him as a potential danger. But the incidents from his previous jobs, the quiet dismissal from the Clearwater pool, complaints about boundary violations that never resulted in charges, these red flags existed in scattered employment files, but were not part of any centralized database that subsequent employers could access. In response to cases like Hannah's, many states updated their employment screening requirements for positions involving contact with children. Missouri passed legislation in 2026 requiring more extensive background checks and reference verification for anyone working in parks, schools, childcare facilities, or other settings where children are present. The law, informally known as Hannah's Law, mandated that employers contact all previous employers for the past 15 years and specifically ask whether there had been any complaints or concerns related to interactions with children, even if those complaints had not resulted in formal disciplinary action. The psychological impact of the case extended beyond those directly involved. In Millbrook and surrounding communities, parents who had been children themselves in 1991 found themselves confronting their own memories and fears. Many had remembered Hannah's disappearance as a defining moment of their childhoods, the point at which innocence ended and fear entered their lives. Learning the details of what had actually happened forced them to process trauma they thought they had dealt with years earlier. School counselors and therapists in the region reported an increase in appointments from adults seeking help, dealing with resurfaced anxiety and grief related to the case. Margaret Briggs's final year of life, though marked by physical decline, held a quality of peace that had been absent for 3 decades. Her sister, Carol Brennan, who moved to Millbrook to care for Margaret after David's death, told reporters that knowing what had happened to Hannah, terrible as it was, had lifted a burden from Margaret's shoulders. The not knowing, Carol said, had been a torture that compounded grief. Margaret spent her final months looking through old photographs, not just of Hannah but of their entire family history, telling Carol stories about Hannah's childhood that she had been unable to share before without being overwhelmed by sorrow and uncertainty. Margaret also met several times with Detective Gonzalez, not to discuss evidence or legal proceedings, but simply to talk about Hannah as a person. Gonzalez, despite her years of experience with violent crime, found these conversations deeply moving. Margaret described Hannah's love of strawberry ice cream, how she would save her allowance to buy stickers at the drugstore, how she sang made-up songs while helping in the garden, how she cried watching sad movies but always wanted to watch them again. These details, mundane and precious, reminded Gonzalez why she did this work, why solving cold cases mattered beyond statistics and case closure rates. Every victim was someone's daughter, someone's whole world, and giving families answers honored the humanity of those who had been lost. In her will, Margaret established a trust fund to support the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, with the request that a portion of the annual disbursement go specifically toward improving forensic capabilities for cold case investigations. The initial funding came from the sale of the Elm Street house and from life insurance policies that David and Margaret had maintained throughout their lives, originally intended to provide for Hannah's education. The Hannah Marie Briggs Trust began making grants in 2027, supporting research into new forensic techniques, training programs for investigators, and victim services for families dealing with missing children cases. The memorial bench in Millbrook became an unofficial pilgrimage site for people from across the country who who had been touched by Hannah's story. Visitors left flowers, stuffed animals, and handwritten notes. A wooden box was installed near the bench where people could place letters or messages. Local volunteers checked the box weekly, preserving the contents in a growing archive. Many of the messages came from parents expressing their love for their own children and their determination to keep them safe. Others came from individuals who had survived childhood trauma, drawing strength from Hannah's story. Some came from law enforcement officers who had worked missing persons cases, honoring a victim whose case had finally been solved. The documentary film Taken, the Hannah Briggs story, released in 2028, won critical acclaim for its sensitive handling of difficult subject matter. The filmmakers chose not to include any details about Hannah's final hours, respecting her dignity and her family's wishes. Instead, the film focused on the investigation, the impact on the community, and the broader issues of child safety and justice. Interviews with Detective Gonzalez, Dr. Fletcher, Frank Hutchinson, and Dale Rivera, Jennifer Walsh, and residents of Millbrook painted a comprehensive picture of how one crime rippled through countless lives. The film included footage from Margaret Briggs's final interview, conducted 3 months before her death. In it, she spoke directly to the camera, addressing other parents who had missing children. She told them never to give up hope for answers, even if those answers came too late to change the outcome. She told them that their grief was valid, that their pain mattered, that their children mattered. She told them that justice delayed was still justice, that truth eventually emerged, and that holding on to love in the face of incomprehensible loss was the most powerful thing a human being could do. The interview reduced viewers to tears but also inspired advocacy groups working on behalf of missing children and cold case victims. The resolution of Hannah's case also had an unexpected impact on other cold cases in Missouri and beyond. Several families with missing children reached out to Detective Gonzalez, asking if the same techniques used to solve Hannah's case might apply to their situations. Gonzalez and her team reviewed dozens of old cases, applying fresh analysis and modern forensic methods. While most did not yield immediate breakthroughs, 3 cases were advanced significantly, and one, involving a teenager who had disappeared in 1997, was solved completely when new DNA analysis of preserved evidence identified a suspect who had since died but whose guilt could now be established, giving the family the answers they had sought for over 25 years. The renewed attention to cold cases led to increased funding for specialized cold case units across Missouri. The state legislature, responding to public pressure following Hannah's case, allocated $2 million annually to support cold case investigations, with a mandate that at least half the funding go toward cases involving missing or murdered children. This funding allowed law enforcement agencies to dedicate personnel specifically to reviewing old cases, to invest in new technology, and to collaborate more effectively across jurisdictions. In Millbrook itself, the solving of Hannah's case brought both closure and reflection. The town had lived with the mystery for so long that it had become part of the community's identity. Now that identity had to shift, incorporating the truth of what had happened and what it meant. Town meetings were held to discuss how to memorialize Hannah appropriately, while also acknowledging the pain the case had caused. There was debate about whether to name a park after Hannah, or whether doing so might forever associate outdoor spaces with her tragedy. Ultimately, the community decided to establish the Hannah Briggs Children's Safety Foundation, housed in a renovated building downtown, offering programs on child safety, self-defense classes for kids, and support services for families. The foundation opened in September 2027 with funding from the town council, private donations, and a significant grant from Margaret Briggs's trust. The building featured a small museum section documenting not Hannah's death, but her life, displaying her artwork from 2nd grade, photographs of her at various ages, her report cards showing good grades and teacher comments praising her kindness, and her collections of stickers and stuffed animals that Margaret had preserved. The display presented Hannah as a real person, not just a victim, someone with interests and personality and a future that had been stolen. Visitors, especially children who came with school groups, learned about Hannah's story in age-appropriate ways that emphasized safety awareness without creating paralyzing fear. The foundation also offered free counseling services for families dealing with trauma related to violence or loss. In its first year of operation, over 200 families utilized these services, many of them dealing with issues unrelated to Hannah's case but finding support through an organization that understood grief and trauma. The foundation partnered with schools throughout the county to implement safety education programs, teaching children about boundaries, appropriate and inappropriate adult behavior, and the importance of telling trusted adults if something made them uncomfortable. These programs, informed by research on child safety and predator behavior, represented a positive legacy emerging from tragedy. Patricia Caldwell, Hannah's second-grade teacher who was now in her 70s and long retired from teaching, visited the foundation shortly after it opened. She walked through the exhibit displaying Hannah's artwork, tears streaming down her face as she recognized pieces she had saved and returned to Margaret years ago. Patricia told the foundation director that she had thought about Hannah almost every day for 33 years, that every June 15th she lit a candle in her window, that she had kept a photograph of her class from that year on her dresser, Hannah smiling in the front row. Patricia had attended Margaret's funeral and had been unable to stop crying throughout the service, mourning not just for her former student and her student's mother, but for all the years of not knowing, all the unanswered questions that had finally been resolved too late for Margaret to find peace in life. The foundation also became a resource for law enforcement agencies seeking to improve their approaches to missing children cases. Detective Gonzalez served on the foundation's advisory board, helping develop best practices guides that were distributed to police departments throughout Missouri and eventually adopted in other states. These guides emphasized the importance of immediate response to reports of missing children, thorough documentation of all witnesses and potential suspects, preservation of all evidence regardless of apparent relevance, and maintaining active investigation even as cases grew cold. The guides also stressed the importance of family liaison, ensuring that families received regular updates even when there were no new developments, recognizing that the uncertainty was often worse than difficult truths. In the years following the resolution of Hannah's case, several scholarly articles and books were published examining various aspects of the crime and investigation. Criminology professors used the case as a teaching tool in classes on criminal profiling, investigative techniques, and victimology. The case appeared in textbooks on forensic psychology, with Dr. Fletcher's analysis of McHale's behavior and journals providing insight into the mind of a sexual predator. Law schools used the case to teach about victim rights, the legal process for cold cases, and the challenges of prosecuting crimes decades after they occurred. Hannah's story, tragic as it was, contributed to the education of professionals who would work to prevent similar tragedies and solve cases when prevention failed. The case also sparked conversations about the death penalty and life sentences for the most serious crimes. Robert McHale had been sentenced to life without parole, but some argued that his crimes warranted the death penalty. Missouri had the death penalty at the time of his conviction, but prosecutors had accepted the plea agreement for practical reasons, knowing that a trial would be traumatic for the community and that McHale's age and health made it likely he would die in prison regardless of the sentence. The debate about appropriate punishment for crimes against children continued in legislative chambers and public forums, with Hannah's case frequently cited by both sides. Those favoring the death penalty argued that some crimes were so heinous that only execution was just. Those opposing capital punishment argued that life in prison was sufficient and that executing elderly offenders served no practical purpose. McHale's death from natural causes in 2027, before any appeal process could be completed, rendered the debate academic in his specific case, but the broader questions remained unresolved. For the hunters who discovered the footlocker, Frank Hutchinson and Dale Rivera, the experience had a profound impact that extended beyond their decision to stop hunting in those woods. Both men became advocates for outdoor recreation, safety, and environmental stewardship. They gave interviews about their discovery, emphasizing that they had been ethical hunters who reported their find immediately, rather than disturbing a potential crime scene. They worked with conservation groups to promote responsible land use and the importance of being observant while in wilderness areas. They also contributed financially to the Hannah Briggs Children's Safety Foundation, using a portion of the modest reward they received for information leading to the case's resolution. Neither man sought publicity or recognition. They had simply been in the right place at the right time and had done the right thing. The landowner of the property where the footlocker was found, a farmer named Dennis Kowalski who had purchased the land in 2005, was shocked to learn what had been buried on his property for decades before he owned it. Kowalski cooperated fully with investigators and allowed extensive searches of other areas of his land to ensure no additional evidence or remains were hidden elsewhere. Nothing more was found, but Kowalski said he would never feel quite the same about the property, knowing what darkness it had concealed. He considered selling, but ultimately decided to stay, reasoning that evil did not contaminate land itself, only the actions of people upon it. He gave permission for the foundation to conduct periodic outdoor safety programs on his property, turning a site associated with tragedy into a place where children could learn about nature and safety in a controlled environment. The question of Hannah's burial location remained the one significant unresolved aspect of the case. Despite extensive efforts, including searches of properties McHale had access to in the early 1990s, ground-penetrating radar surveys, and consultation with experts in forensic geography, Hannah's remains were never located. Some speculated that McHale had disposed of her body in a body of water, perhaps the river that flowed through Millbrook County, where remains might have been carried downstream or never recovered. Others thought he might have buried her in a location that had since been developed, paved over, or otherwise altered beyond recognition. Dr. Fletcher's analysis of McHale's psychology suggested that he might have chosen a burial site with personal significance, perhaps connected to his childhood or to locations he associated with control and power, but this speculation did not narrow the search area sufficiently to be useful. Margaret had expressed in her final months that she had made peace with not knowing where Hannah's body rested. She told her sister Carol that Hannah's spirit was not in whatever remained of her physical body, that Hannah's true essence lived in the memories of those who loved her, and in the impact her story had on efforts to protect other children. This acceptance was hard-won, coming only after decades of desperate hoping and searching. Margaret had participated in multiple organized searches over the years, walking through woods and fields calling Hannah's name long after rational hope of finding her alive had faded, simply needing to feel she was doing something. The knowledge that McHale had been caught and punished provided a different kind of closure than recovering Hannah's remains would have, but it was closure nonetheless, and Margaret had been grateful for it in her final year. The forensic team that examined the footlocker and its contents also made several observations that added to the understanding of the case. The Polaroid photographs, while horrifying in content, provided timestamps that helped establish a timeline of events. The photos showed daylight through a small basement window, suggesting Hannah had been held somewhere during the late afternoon and early evening of June 15th. Forensic analysis of backgrounds visible in the photos, including distinctive stone foundation walls and wooden ceiling joists, helped narrow down the type of structure where Hannah had been held. Investigators believed it was likely a root cellar or old basement on an abandoned or rarely used property, but despite examining dozens of such locations in the area, they never definitively identified the specific site. The psychological toll on investigators who worked on Hannah's case, both in 1991 and in 2024, was significant and often underappreciated. Detective Gonzalez spoke openly about the emotional difficulty of working on cases involving children, of reading McHale's journals, of viewing the Polaroid photographs that documented Hannah's terror. She attended regular counseling sessions and encouraged her team members to do the same, recognizing that exposure to such extreme human cruelty could cause secondary traumatic stress. Several investigators who had worked the original case in 1991 and were now retired or near retirement contacted Gonzalez after the arrest, expressing mixed emotions. They felt relief that the case was solved, but also renewed anguish over what Hannah had suffered, and renewed questioning about whether they had missed something that might have led to an earlier resolution. Chief Raymond Fuller, who had led the initial investigation in 1991 and was now in his 80s, gave an interview to the local newspaper after McHale's conviction. Fuller said that Hannah's case had haunted him throughout his career and into retirement. He had reviewed the case files countless times over the years, always hoping to spot something he had missed. Learning that McHale had been one of the people he had personally interviewed was particularly difficult for Fuller. He wondered if he had asked different questions, pressed harder, been more suspicious. Could Hannah have been saved? Detective Gonzalez reached out to Fuller personally, assuring him that McHale had fooled everyone, that his ability to appear normal and helpful was what had made him dangerous, that no individual investigator bore responsibility for his escaping detection. The case also highlighted the importance of community vigilance in protecting children. While it was true that predators often occupied positions of trust, making them difficult to identify, research showed that people who paid attention to warning signs and reported concerns could prevent crimes or facilitate earlier detection. The Hannah Briggs Children's Safety Foundation developed programs teaching adults to recognize grooming behaviors and boundary violations, encouraging them to report concerns even when unsure whether something was truly wrong. The foundation emphasized that it was better to report something that turned out to be innocent than to remain silent when a child might be in danger. This message resonated with communities across Missouri and beyond, as parents and educators learned about subtle signs that might indicate a child was being targeted or abused. Educational institutions also updated their policies in response to lessons learned from Hannah's case and others like it. Schools implemented stricter supervision protocols, ensuring that children were never alone with adults in unsupervised situations. Background checks became more comprehensive, with requirements that they be updated every few years rather than just at initial hiring. Mandatory reporting training for all staff members emphasized the legal and moral obligations to report suspicions of child abuse or neglect. Youth organizations like Scouts, sports teams, and church groups adopted similar policies, recognizing that predators sought out organizations where they could access children with minimal oversight. The anniversary of Hannah's disappearance, June 15th, became a day of remembrance in Millbrook. Each year, the community gathered at the memorial bench for a brief ceremony honoring Hannah and all children who had been victims of violence. The ceremony was not morbid or focused on death, but rather celebrated childhood innocence and reaffirmed the community's commitment to protecting children. Children who attended the ceremony released biodegradable balloons, each carrying a message of hope or a drawing. Adults recommitted themselves to vigilance and care. Local leaders spoke about progress made in child safety while acknowledging ongoing challenges. The ceremony concluded with a moment of silence, during which many people privately remembered not just Hannah but other children they had known who had been lost to violence, illness, or accident, a collective acknowledgement of grief and resilience. Over time, Hannah's story found its place in the broader narrative of American crime and justice. True crime enthusiasts discussed the case on podcasts and in online forums, analyzing the investigation, debating what could have been done differently, and expressing sympathy for Hannah and her family. While some critics argued that true crime as entertainment was exploitative and disrespectful to victims, others countered that public interest in criminal cases kept pressure on law enforcement to solve them, generated tips that sometimes led to breakthroughs, and educated people about safety and justice system processes. Hannah's case exemplified both the potential benefits and ethical challenges of true crime media. The attention her case received certainly helped keep it in public consciousness, but it also meant that Hannah's worst moment was discussed and analyzed by strangers, her suffering dissected for content. The Briggs family, extended members who had lived through decades of uncertainty and grief, found different ways to cope with the resolution of the case and its aftermath. Margaret's sister Carol, who had been instrumental in caring for Margaret in her final year, became involved with the foundation, serving on its board of directors and helping shape its programs. Carol said that honoring Hannah's memory through work that protected other children gave meaning to loss that otherwise seemed senseless and pointless. Other family members were more private in their grief, declining media interviews and requests to participate in documentaries or public events. Both approaches were valid, representing different needs for processing trauma and loss. The technological advances that contributed to solving Hannah's case represented a broader trend in forensic science. DNA analysis, digital databases, advanced imaging techniques, and improved communication networks among law enforcement agencies had revolutionized cold case investigations since the 1990s. Cases that seemed hopelessly unsolved when they occurred were being cracked decades later through methods that had not existed at the time of the original investigations. This gave hope to families of missing persons and unsolved homicide victims that their cases might eventually be solved, that advances in science and technology might provide answers that previous generations of investigators could not obtain. The National Institute of Justice and other organizations invested in research to develop new forensic techniques specifically for cold cases, recognizing that thousands of families across America were still waiting for answers. In academic settings, Hannah's case became a staple reference in courses on criminal justice, psychology, and social work. Students studied the investigative process, the challenges of maintaining a case over decades, the importance of community involvement, and the psychological impact on victims' families. Mock exercises required students to review case evidence and develop investigative strategies, teaching critical thinking and analytical skills. Guest lectures by Detective Gonzalez and other individuals involved in the case brought real-world perspective to academic theories. Students often reported that learning about Hannah's case motivated them to pursue careers in law enforcement, victim advocacy, or related fields, wanting to be part of the solution to preventing and solving crimes against children. The media coverage of Hannah's case also sparked important conversations about how missing children cases are reported and investigated. Research had long shown that missing children from certain demographics received disproportionate media attention compared to others, a phenomenon sometimes called missing white woman syndrome, though it applied to children as well. Hannah, as a blonde, white, middle-class child from a small town, received extensive media coverage both at the time of her disappearance and again when her case was solved. Advocates for missing children from minority communities and lower-income families pointed out that many cases involving Black, Hispanic, Native American, and poor children received minimal attention, making those cases harder to solve due to lack of public awareness and pressure. The discussion prompted some news organizations to reevaluate their coverage decisions and commit to more equitable treatment of missing persons cases regardless of the victim's race or socioeconomic status. The resolution of Hannah's case after 33 years demonstrated that persistence in investigation could yield results even when hope seemed lost. Other families with long unsolved cases drew inspiration from the Briggs family's experience, refusing to give up their own quests for answers. Organizations dedicated to solving cold cases received increased funding and volunteer support following the publicity around Hannah's case. Genealogists who had helped solve other cold cases through DNA family tree analysis offered their services to investigators working on unsolved crimes. Retired detectives volunteered their time to review old case files, bringing experienced eyes to evidence that younger investigators might interpret differently. A network of professionals and volunteers committed to justice for forgotten victims grew stronger and more organized. The question of forgiveness arose in discussions about Hannah's case, though it was a deeply personal matter with no universal answer. Some people felt that Margaret's decision not to call for the death penalty and her focus on moving forward with the foundation represented a form of forgiveness, or at least a release of hatred. Others argued that forgiveness was neither necessary nor appropriate for someone who had committed such evil acts, that justice and closure did not require absolving the perpetrator. Religious leaders in Millbrook and beyond wrestled with theological questions about mercy, punishment, and redemption. Some argued that Christian teaching required forgiveness even of the worst sinners. Others countered that forgiveness was between McHale and God, that human justice systems existed for practical reasons of protection and accountability rather than spiritual redemption. These discussions highlighted the complexity of human response to trauma and evil, the impossibility of prescribing how victims and their families should feel, or what attitudes they should adopt. The impact of Hannah's case on the Millbrook community extended to economic and social dimensions beyond the immediate trauma and grief. Property values in neighborhoods near where Hannah had disappeared dropped noticeably in the 1990s as families avoided the area and some residents moved away entirely. The park where she was last seen, once a popular gathering place, fell into disuse and eventually became overgrown before being sold for development. Local businesses suffered as people spent less time outdoors and avoided recreational activities where the tragedy had occurred. The psychological shadow cast by Hannah's disappearance affected the community for decades. Following the case resolution and the opening of the foundation, there were signs of healing and renewal. New families moved into the area, unaware of or willing to accept the history. Community events increased as people felt safer gathering publicly. The downtown area, which had declined somewhat, experienced modest revitalization, partly driven by visitors coming to the foundation and memorial. The town was reclaiming its identity as more than the place where Hannah Briggs disappeared, though that history would always be part of its story. Forensic artists who had created age progression images of Hannah over the years reflected on their work with mixed emotions. These specialists used scientific understanding of how faces age, combined with photographs of biological relatives, to create images showing what missing persons might look like years after their disappearance. In Hannah's case, progressions had been created showing her at ages 18, 25, and 30, distributed in hopes that someone might recognize an adult woman who did not know her true identity. The discovery that Hannah had died the day she disappeared rendered these images heartbreakingly irrelevant, predictions of a future that never existed. Yet the artists defended their work as necessary, pointing out that in many cases such images had led to successful identifications and reunions. Hannah's case was a tragedy but not a failure of the technique, which remained valuable for ongoing missing persons investigations. The role of volunteers in Hannah's case, both in the original 1991 search efforts and in the years that followed, demonstrated the power of community mobilization. Hundreds of people had devoted countless hours to searching for Hannah, distributing flyers, manning tip lines, and simply being present for the Briggs family. In the months following the case resolution, several community organizations in Millbrook and other towns established formal volunteer networks to assist law enforcement with future missing persons cases. These networks provided trained volunteers who could be mobilized quickly to conduct searches, manage communication, and support families in crisis. The volunteers received training in search techniques, evidence preservation, and trauma-informed support, ensuring they could help effectively without compromising investigations. The networks represented a positive legacy emerging from tragedy, communities organizing to protect their most vulnerable members and support each other in crisis. Looking at the broader landscape of missing children cases in America, Hannah's story was unfortunately not unique. Every year, hundreds of thousands of children are reported missing, though the vast majority are quickly located, having run away, been taken by non-custodial parents, or simply misunderstood. But a smaller number, still tragically significant, represent true stranger abductions or cases where children are harmed by family members or acquaintances. Organizations like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children work tirelessly to improve prevention, response, and investigation of these cases. The publicity from high-profile solved cases like Hannah's helps these organizations raise awareness and funding, turning individual tragedies into catalysts for broader protective efforts. The challenge lies in sustaining attention and resources, even when there is no dramatic breakthrough to generate headlines, maintaining commitment to the long, slow work of prevention and investigation. The final disposition of Robert McHale's personal effects and property after his death raised practical and ethical questions. His trailer in Arkansas contained decades of accumulated possessions, including disturbing materials related to his crimes. Law enforcement retained everything relevant to investigations or potential additional prosecutions. Items with no evidentiary value were disposed of according to state procedures for handling estates of deceased prisoners with no heirs. McHale had no assets of significant value, no property or savings that might have been used for victim restitution. His body was cremated at county expense, his ashes scattered without ceremony. In death as in life, he remained insignificant except for the evil he had committed, a cautionary example of how damaged individuals could cause disproportionate harm to innocent victims and entire communities. The Hannah Briggs Children's Safety Foundation expanded its mission over time to address emerging threats to children. As technology advanced and children gained access to smartphones and social media at younger ages, the foundation developed programs teaching digital safety and awareness of online predators. Experts led workshops for parents about monitoring children's online activities while respecting age-appropriate privacy. Children learned about protecting personal information, recognizing manipulation attempts, and reporting concerning interactions. The foundation recognized that while stranger danger in physical spaces remained a concern, modern predators increasingly use technology to identify, groom, and exploit victims. Adapting to these evolving threats ensured the Foundation's continued relevance in protecting children from harm. 10 years after the case was solved, in 2034, Millbrook held a major commemoration event, marking what would have been Hannah's 51st birthday. The event brought together many individuals whose lives had intersected with Hannah's story, from childhood friends who barely remembered her to investigators who had dedicated years to finding answers about her fate. Reverend Jacobson, now in his 80s and in failing health, attended and offered a prayer blessing Hannah's memory and asking for continued strength for all those touched by her story. Carol Brennan, Margaret's sister, spoke about her sister's courage and enduring love. Detective Gonzalez, retired from the Highway Patrol but still active in cold case advocacy, discussed the ongoing work to solve other cases and protect other children. The event was both somber and hopeful, acknowledging terrible loss while celebrating the positive changes that had emerged in response. As new generations grew up in Millbrook, Hannah's story became history rather than living memory for most residents. Children attending schools in the 2030s learned about Hannah in age-appropriate ways, understanding her story as part of their community's past and as a reason for the safety programs they participated in. Teachers found that Hannah's story helped children understand abstract concepts about safety and stranger danger in concrete terms, providing context for rules and precautions that might otherwise seem arbitrary. The challenge for educators was presenting the information in ways that promoted awareness without creating excessive fear, teaching children to be cautious without making them paranoid or stealing their sense of security in the world. The broader legacy of Hannah Briggs extended beyond the specifics of her case to influence how American society thought about child safety, criminal investigation, and community responsibility. Her story joined others in the collective consciousness, tragic cases that shaped policy, changed behavior, and motivated action to prevent similar tragedies. While it was cold comfort to know that something positive emerged from such horror, advocates working to protect children found purpose in transforming grief into action, turning the worst of human behavior into motivation for the best of human response. The parents who held their children a little tighter, the communities that implemented better safety programs, the investigators who refused to give up on cold cases, all represented responses to evil that denied it complete victory. Ultimately, the story of Hannah Marie Briggs is a story about loss, justice, resilience, and love. It is about a 7-year-old girl who deserved to grow up and did not get that chance. It is about parents who endured unimaginable pain with dignity and grace. It is about a community that refused to forget, that kept searching for answers even when years passed without progress. It is about investigators who persisted in seeking truth and bringing a predator to justice. It is about hunters who stumbled upon evidence and did the right thing. It is about ordinary people responding to extraordinary circumstances with courage and compassion. And it is about how even the darkest stories can yield lessons and legacies that honor victims and protect the living. Hannah's life was brief, but her impact continues, ripples spreading outward from that terrible June day in 1991, touching lives and changing futures in ways large and small. She matters, and she will be remembered.